Hello and welcome to my presentation on games and argumentation based off Activision's 1981 Stampede. My name is Marina White, and let's continue on with this presentation. Here on this slide, I am showing you the table of contents, which covers everything that we will be covering in this presentation. Our first thing that we will be covering is Stampede and the context and systems of the game. Our second, the central argument in Stampede and its promotion of a hardcore gamer. Third, the paratext in Stampede and how theming and language sets the scene. And fourth, hardcore gameplay and what about Stampede's gameplay is hardcore. Our first topic, Stampede and the context and systems of the game. Stampede was released by the game company Activision in 1981. Activision was the first successful third-party game company that created video games for the console platform, and they are also credited with being the company that began the rise in popularity of third-party companies creating games for home consoles. Activision made games for the Intellivision and the Atari 2600. Gameplay-wise, there is no difference between the two as expected. Nowadays, Activision is considered to be one of the most popular game companies on the market. Now I'll be explaining Stampede's gameplay and its systems. The objective of Stampede is to lasso the cattle in the Stampede to increase your high score. Now, there are several systems that allow you to achieve the objective. The cowboy can move up and down the screen. The cowboy can cause the cattle to run in front of him by trailing directly behind them. The cowboy can use the lasso to capture the cattle, and lassoing the cattle adds points to your high score. Now, there's four different cattle that you can lasso in this game. The brown cattle, which happen to be the slowest ones, only give you 3 points. The tan cattle, which are the intermediate speed, give you 15. The beige cattle are the quickest ones, and they give you 25 points. The black cattle don't actually move and are actually stationed at certain points on your game screen, and if you capture the black cattle, you get 100 points. Now the catch is, if you run into cattle schools and black cattle, the cowboy will be immobilized for a moment, and the game will end when 3 cattle lag behind the cowboy. Now, the difficulty lies with mostly into the black cattle, because the black cattle, although they are stationary, they still do count as a cattle falling behind if you do not lasso them. So when you miss a black cattle in the midst of trying to keep all the other cattle in front of you, it causes you a point. And when you lose 3 cattle behind you, the game ends. So what exactly is a system? A system is defined as all the aspects of the game that work together to create a cohesive game experience. So how do systems work in Stampede? All of Stampede's systems work together to create a competitive game experience for the player where they're challenged to master the game's rules, which is reflected quantitatively through your high score. Alright, so now that we have a little bit of context behind the game Stampede, I think it's time that I move into my central argument. Stampede serves as a palpable representation of the hardcore game culture that masculinized competition in video games. The game achieves this through the use of gendered marketing tactics as well as through the use of paratext within the game's advertisement. Since this is such a dense argument, I will be splitting it into smaller parts, the first being masculinity in advertising. The masculinity that is present in Stampede derives from the gender marketing that Activision used when advertising their game. In the advertisement on the right, 12 grown men give you an intimidating stare down, calling you to play like a man and accept the challenge that is hurting a Stampede. The language used when the ad asks you to rise to the challenge and play like a man suggests that this game is meant for a male audience, and only the most masculine of men can successfully take on the challenge. So what is gender marketing? Gender marketing is when a game company uses imagery or language in their advertising to appeal to a specific gender audience. Now, how does this work in Stampede? The advertisement in Stampede heavily plays into gender marketing tactics, using the images of tough cowboys and doubtful language to challenge players into proving how much of a man they are. The way in which the game is advertised suggests that Stampede's gameplay is quite difficult and requires great time and effort to become a skilled player. The difficulty and dedicated time that the game demanded from the player was meant to intimidate female audiences while attracting male audiences with strong masculine tendencies. As the player continues to get better and better at the game, they are proving, whether that be to the developers or to themselves, how much of a man they are. So far, we have been looking at advertisement from promotional box art for the game. The television advertisement for this game only further reinforces the masculine message, and it does so on a platform that can reach an extremely wide audience. Please pay close attention to the following video.
I've been driving cattle most of my natural life, and you're telling me I can't handle a Stampede?
Not this one, Buck.
Stampede by Activision for your Atari game system. One of the toughest video games around. Stampede's more than expert roping and riding. It's a test of strategy and skill.
Go ahead, you
Keep
do
your
it.
hands on the ride!
Buck, you boys come in now.
Oh, Mom!
Stampede by Activision.
The television ad depicts Stampede as a wild and intimidating experience that takes real skill to play. Notice also how both people seen playing Stampede were tough, experienced cowboys, which indicates to the player that becoming skilled at the game can make them too appear masculine and respectable. Next, we will be looking at the paratext in Stampede and how the theming and language sets the scene for the game. Okay, so what is paratext? Paratext refers to how the player experiences the game outside of the game itself. That can be either through characterization, through visual art, through fantasy. The list goes on. Just as long as it doesn't actually lie somewhere within the gameplay, it's considered paratext. So how does this apply to Stampede? The paratext provided by the art and narrative of Stampede allows the player to immerse themselves in a fantasy where they are toughest cowboys in the West. So once again, that goes back to the fact that paratext can be any game experience outside of the gameplay itself. That being said, welcome to the Wild West. Stampede used promotional art and narrative language to signal to the player the world that this game exists in. Activision created Stampede to run on two console platforms, the Atari 2600 and the Intellivision. The game ran the same on both consoles, but they used very different box art. Atari's depiction of the Stampede uses colorful cartoon silhouettes of a cowboy and cattle running wild, while the Intellivision uses realistic depictions of a manly cowboy on horseback as he rounds up cattle using a lasso. Although the art box for both games differs so drastically from each other, they both are trying to achieve the same purpose: to put the player in a world where they can live out the masculine fantasy of being a robust cowboy. Atari's use of cartoon figures is meant to directly signal to the player that they are entering a world that is outside of reality, and since this fantasy world is one in which they have control, they are free to immerse themselves in the persona of the cowboy. Intellivision's use of realistic art style is meant to make the game feel more realistic to the player, which allows them to immerse themselves into the role of cowboy seemingly in true reality. Both the Atari's and the Intellivision's visual paratext, although in different manners, successfully allow the players to immerse themselves in the masculine fantasy world of Stampede. While the average person sees the box artwork on the right, the player who's actually playing the game sees themselves as the toughest cowboy in the West. Yeehaw! So how does Stampede's gender marketing and use of paratext make it the hardcore game that it is? Now I know what you're thinking. Wait, this game is supposed to be hardcore? How does that make any sense? Well, visually, Stampede does not look like a game that represents a hyper-masculine, hardcore player base, partially because of the pixel capabilities of video games in that given time period. However, Stampede truly shines as a hardcore game through the way in which it plays. As previously mentioned, the objective of the game is to lasso cattle in the Stampede to increase your high score. This is the only way in which the game can be played to receive any reward from the player's end. If you were to not lasso the cattle, they will pass behind you and the game will end after 3 cattle fall behind you. If you choose not to let the cattle fall behind you but refuse to lasso them, the game will continue, but you'll not score any points, and eventually the game will end when you accidentally let 3 cattle fall behind you. I know this from experience, because the first time I played the game, I couldn't figure out how to actually lasso the cattle, so I was stuck just pushing them all in front of me until I eventually let 3 fall behind. But I digress. Therefore, you are left with one sole option: accept the challenge and compete against the game system. All hardcore games hold that one thing in common, that the player must abide by the game's rules and compete against the system in order to receive a reward. This game uses a quantitative measure of high score to motivate the player to continue playing, and the higher your score is, the more difficult the game becomes. This idea of difficulty and trial heavily appeals to competitive masculine audiences who enjoy playing games to prove that they can take up the seemingly impossible challenge. This excerpt from Tetris Rules further explains how the rules and systems of games control the way in which players interact with it. It reads, "The rigid system of rules that delimit player agency would seemingly foreclose the possibility of locating liberating play in such games. Indeed, the presence of constitutive and regulative rules tamp down opportunities for open-ended play. If one evaluates games only by their synchronous rules, set or by determinations of eagle-eyed referees, the medium would be an oppressive one. This oppression would be enhanced by the obvious rigidity of the technical medium on which the game takes place, the computer. So, what does this all mean? Rules work to constrain the player to abiding by the game systems. All games have rules, but hardcore games in particular are the most strict when it comes down to forcing players to conform to the rules. In a game like Stampede, the player is not given options where they can successfully play the game without playing within the game's preconceived rules. However, it is also this strict structure that levies the player the most opportunity to compete within the system. So when we put it all together, we see that Stampede's systems and paratext work simultaneously to create a hardcore game environment that encourages masculine competition while creating a hostile environment for female gamers. Stampede was advertised by Activision to be a man's game that required a great deal of skill and guts to take on, presumably traits that women did not possess. The masculine sphere that Stampede created as a result from attracting a predominantly male audience encouraged competition to prove their masculinity, and it was this nature of competition and the need to prove oneself that introduced the idea of the hardcore game culture. What does modern hardcore game culture look like? Modern hardcore games continue to follow the theme of competition, except with online multiplayer, that sense of competition is amplified. Players are no longer limited to competing alone against the game system. They are now also able to be pitted in competition against the game system along with other teammates via co-op mode, and they can even be pitted against one another to prove their skill, such as in PvP. If the competitive environment for hardcore games during Stampede's release was hostile, then the hardcore game environment in modern competitive games can only be ever more hostile for non-competitive audiences. When you are exposed to players of different skill levels all playing the same game, players feel encouraged to prove to the other players that they are the best at the game. Depending on the paratext of the game, it might also encourage the competitive nature among players. That being said, those who do not match up to the competitive standards of being good at the game are outcasted, and oftentimes they're treated negatively. This concludes my presentation. Thank you for listening.